The Art of Leadership Network.
We all have a tendency to see ourselves as better than we really are. And there's a problem there because when we don't acknowledge where we're really at, we don't get an accurate gauge of where we want to be and where we're going.
Helping you design your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. This is Win Today. And now, here's your host, Christopher Cook.
Hey friends, thanks so much for joining me this week for episode 287 of the podcast, where today we're talking with licensed professional counselor and author Debra Fileta about why we are not as healthy as we think we are. Now, there's a lot loading that statement, and we'll unpack all of it today with Debra. But know this mental and emotional health conversation is so relevant to all of us, especially in our present moment where society says, do what feels good, trust yourself, and live your truth, right? But hey, first, before we hop into the conversation with Debra, I want to take a moment to tell you all about my weekly email, Win the Week, which is all about getting under the hood of your heart so that incremental steps toward transformation can be made in your mental and your emotional health and in your spiritual growth. Guys, it's a quick win, quick read, no frills weekly email designed to be read and applied in less than 5 minutes. It drops in your inbox every single Wednesday. It's absolutely free. So go sign up right now at wintoday.tv. And lastly, before we head into the conversation with Debra, if you're enjoying the podcast, do share it, send a text to a friend, and invite them to listen as well. And then if you would, rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening, especially on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts. Here's why. When you rate, when you review, and when you share the podcast, the listenership grows and we get the opportunity to help even more people design their roadmap to wholeness from the inside out, spirit, soul, body. It's as simple as that. So thank you for listening and for doing just that. Right now, I'm so excited to hop into this conversation with my friend, Debra Fileta, all about why you're not as healthy as you think you are. Take some notes, get ready. You're listening to Win Today on the Art of Leadership Network. Debra, welcome to the podcast. It's been a long time coming, and it's really great to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, hey, I want to head right in. And in fact, Debra, you make a really strong statement that I just want to dive into. And it's this: you're not as healthy as you think you are. Why not? Yeah. I mean, take us under the hood. So good.
I know. Isn't that interesting? The book, Are You Really Okay, starts out with that statement as the very first sentence. And it's funny because it's kind of a presumptuous statement. But I will tell you this, Chris, these are the type of people I want joining along on this journey. If you can read that statement and think, you know what, let's unpack this a little bit, and it doesn't totally turn you off, and you're the kind of person I want to have a conversation with. And what's interesting is that statement comes from a social study called the Better Than Average Effect. And, I'm a licensed counselor, and I always joke that my sociology friends are a little bit strange because they have all these random research projects and social experiments. And one of the social experiments is called the Better Than Average Effect. And so what they did is they took a group of people and they asked them to rate themselves on a scale of how good do you think you are on these different things, such as morality, kindness, even how good of a driver do you think you are? And what they found to be so intriguing was that the majority of people rated themselves as better than average. I'm better than average. I'm better than the rest, And what's interesting about that is, mathematically speaking, we can't all be better than average. The majority cannot be better than average. Someone's got to fall below the mean. But we usually don't think that we're the ones that fall below the mean. We usually tend to see ourselves as better than we really are. And so they thought, well, maybe this is like situational. Maybe it's people in the suburbs, or maybe it's people with high income that think this. Well, then they took the same experiment to the prisons to ask the prisoners, like, what do you think about yourself compared to your non-prisoner peers? Are you more moral? Are you more kind? And sure enough, Even the prisoners rated themselves as better than average. And so whether you're a pastor, Chris, or a prisoner, we all have a tendency to see ourselves as better than we really are. And there's a problem there, because when we don't acknowledge where we're really at, we don't get an accurate gauge of where we want to be and where we're going.
Can you say that last statement one more time? Because I actually want to take us into self-awareness. And I think this is a huge linchpin for this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. When we don't have a good gauge of how we're actually doing, we lose our ability to see where we're going and to see what's up ahead and where we want to be.
I mean, just to fast forward a little bit, obviously we need to touch on sitting with emotions, naming our emotions, being willing to go back into the recesses of our heart to explore like what events, what experiences triggered things in my life that now affect me 10, 15, 20 years down the road. But just to put a pin on this, Debra, I think one of the key tools we can employ in life, therefore, is self-awareness, but also self-knowledge. How does self-awareness play a role in turning the key on where we started then? You're not as healthy as you think you are.
Yeah, self-awareness is essentially the door that we open to walk into this process of becoming healthy, taking good inventory of how we're actually doing. It's not a coincidence that this book title is a question. Are you really okay? Because it's not up to me to answer that question. It's up to you. And I think sometimes as believers, as Christians especially, we make the false assumption that just because I'm a Christian means I'm going to be pretty healthy. And the problem with that assumption is that it's false. Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you're healthy. When you come to Jesus, it doesn't magically change your physical demeanor. You don't all of a sudden have low cholesterol and your blood sugar levels are just right. Your BMI is where it needs to be. So then why do we make that assumption with our emotional, our spiritual, our mental health? Why do we assume that when we become Christians, all of those things are going to be as they need to be? So the self-awareness piece is important here because it's the guide, it's the door that we walk through as we begin to assess these areas of our life. And to kind of summarize it for you, one of the reasons I'm really intent on focusing on these 4 quadrants: emotional health, spiritual health, mental health, physical health, is partly because as a therapist, I think it's holistic experience to become healthy. But if we look at scripture, when the disciples asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. He could have easily just said, love the Lord your God, period. Why did he break it up into those 4 quadrants? Because it requires us to have self-awareness and insight into how healthy am I in my heart, my emotional health, my soul, which represents my spiritual health, my mind, which represents my mental health, my strength, which represents my physical health. So loving God well means we align these 4 quadrants of who we are to who he calls us to be. And there's work involved in that.
That's so helpful, Debra. And I'd love for you to speak to all of us as a professional counselor in this, because self-awareness is that. It's awareness of, but it doesn't guarantee that we're going to act on that awareness. And that's where I think self-knowledge comes into play. In other words, if I was texting while driving and got pulled over, self-awareness says, yup, I was texting while driving. I admit it, I was doing it. But then applied self-knowledge forces me to ask myself the question, Chris, why were you doing that in the first place? Oh, I thought if I didn't respond to this person at this time, then I'd be viewed as irresponsible or whatever. Can you take us down the rabbit hole a little bit of self-knowledge then? So how do we take the self-awareness then and put it into place so that we can catalyze change in life?
Yeah, if you look at your awareness in the terms that you're presenting, Chris, if you look at your awareness, kind of like your behavior, I'm aware that I'm doing A, B, and C. Here's what I'm actually doing. I think then the next step is to dig a little bit deeper and ask why. Why am I doing those things? And one thing that I am such a advocate is for us to realize that behavior modification alone will only take us so far, because we've got to get to the roots of why we do what we do. And in counseling and psychology, we know that thoughts lead to feelings, which then lead to behaviors. So when we just focus on the behavior, let me just adjust this or try to do this differently. That's why New Year's resolutions fail, because we're trying to alter the behavior without getting to the root of why we're doing what we're doing, and begin to change the why, begin to change the thoughts and the feelings that are leading to the behavior. And all of that put in a blender is the process of becoming healthy emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and even physically.
You've just unplugged the strength, the perceived strength of willpower then.
Right.
It's a limited commodity.
Yeah, absolutely. And willpower alone, how we define willpower in our culture is like your desire to do something and you get it done. But if there's obstacles and barriers and things keeping you stuck that you're not actually sure what they are, you're going to hit a wall. And so I don't know, I'm super excited about being able to have these conversations and help people find freedom from past hurts and wounds and trauma, and to be able to find out why they're stuck and move into a place of freedom and abundance and just living the best life that God intended for them to live.
That's good. You said something a moment ago that I want to go back to, because I've actually asked a similar question to people and have been in research myself. And it's this: do emotions affect thoughts, or do thoughts affect emotions? And I think you said that thoughts affect emotions, but I'd love to hear your insight as a therapist and even recent psychological data on that.
Well, it used to be said that feelings created thoughts. The most recent research is showing us that it's actually the thoughts that come first, this automated, subconscious thought process of what's going on behind the scenes, usually rooted in our beliefs about life, beliefs that have been adapted throughout our circumstances, throughout our experiences, our family of origin, whatever it is. You believe certain things, which cause you to then feel certain things, which cause you to act in a certain way. Now, does that mean feelings can't ever create thoughts? Well, no, that doesn't mean that. You know, you can be struggling with depression, and part of the reason you're struggling is because there's unhealthy thought process. But the struggle with depression can also lead you to believe and think unhealthy things as well. And you get caught in this little bit of a cycle, you know?
Do you think that's why Paul told us to take every thought captive and not every emotion captive?
100%. In fact, I always joke that Romans 12 is what we call as therapists, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's like the process of changing your thoughts, transforming your thinking, reframing things. And we use it in therapy. It's a very basic, common mode of therapy, but it's in scripture because God knows how we work as human beings. It's not foreign concept to him. We just have taken these principles and kind of repackaged them. But the importance of taking ownership of your thoughts is a huge component to all of this, and why I dedicate an entire section to our mental and cognitive health. So
I'd love for this conversation to be, and it has been thus far, super applicable, so the listeners can walk away with points and go, okay, now I can put my ear to the ground and do the work in my own life. So let's just go back to where we started. You're not as healthy as you think you are. And I think all of us can look in the mirror and say there are areas of our heart that would ring true to that. So just play this out, Debra. If you're our therapist and we walk into your office, first step out of this cycle, what do you do first tactically when we come to the realization that we're not as healthy as we think we are?
Well, if we look at health as holistic, like we said, heart, soul, mind, and strength, I don't necessarily think it matters where we start because it's a circle, it's a cycle, and one will lead us to the next thing. But we've got to start somewhere. And so I start with emotional health because I think it's the easiest to conceptualize. And also because when Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, he starts with the heart. So we start there. What does that look like? So what does it look like to be emotionally healthy? Are you emotionally healthy? We hear a lot about emotional IQ, emotional intelligence, emotional health. What does that actually mean? Well, I break that down into 3 steps. First is your ability to identify your emotions, then your ability to express your emotions, followed by your ability to question your emotions. So if we talk through that a little bit, your ability to identify your emotions. One of the most common phrases that people say in response to my question of, how do you feel? How do you, therapists are stereotypical, like when you look at the cartoons, the question, how does that make you feel, always comes up, but there is power in identifying what we feel. And many times when I ask that question, the response is, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know if I feel anything. Sometimes we don't actually know how we feel because we spend so much time in this superficial world above the surface. We're not ready and willing and prepared to go deep and to actually sit with how we feel. We can feel uncomfortable with emotions, and we don't even realize that we're uncomfortable with emotions. For example, have you ever started to get emotional and tear up, and next thing you know, you're like covering your face or apologizing? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Why do you feel the need to apologize? There might be some sort of discomfort with emotions. And for us to be emotionally healthy people, we've got to learn to go underneath the surface because emotions are powerful. One analogy that I use in the book is to see our emotional capacity kind of like a volcano. There's all of this pressure building underneath the surface. And if you don't identify and deal with that pressure in a healthy way, what's going to happen is it's going to find the point of least resistance, and it's going to come up in the form of an emotional explosion. When you look at the past couple years with COVID and 2020 and quarantine and masks and vaccines and stress and jobs and finances, that emotional explosion has happened for so many people because of the pressure of the past couple of years. It's finding the point of least resistance. Maybe that emotional explosion looks different for different people. It could come up in the form of a panic attack or clinical depression or anxiety. It could be relationship tension and problems. It could be an addiction, falling back into relapse, whatever it is. But the key is, what is happening underneath the surface that has gotten me to this point? And if you can't recognize and identify your emotions, that is literally the first step to becoming an emotionally healthy person. So we got to start there.
That's really powerful. Just real quick, can you help us differentiate, and this is just a place of pure curiosity for me, the difference between emotional health and mental health? And here's why I ask the question, because I read a scripture like Proverbs 4. Yeah. Keep and guard your heart with all diligence, and above all that you guard, for out of it flows the issues of life. But the Hebrew writers, that word, the Hebrew word for heart there, is our emotional center. It's our mind. It's our inner being. So how do you differentiate the two and then approach conversations like this?
Yeah. I think the most simple way to differentiate is to see our emotional health as the things that have to do with what we feel. So we'll put it in that category. And then our mental health is a combination of what we think, our cognitions, like I said earlier, but also our chemistry, because there is a component to that underneath the surface, our wiring, our chemical makeup that starts to then affect the rest of our life, our emotions, it affects our minds. So I kind of put them into those two categories. When we talk about mental health, we're talking about both our cognitions and our chemistry. And when we're talking about emotional health, we're talking about how we feel and express and question and control our emotions.
That's so helpful. Well, Debra, I'd love to turn the page a little bit. You wrote in the book, the average person doesn't truly understand how significant their past is in shaping their emotional health. How significant is it? Reconcile this disconnect for us.
Yeah, oftentimes in counseling, we act out of what's happening in the present, and we think the problem is really about the present, but there's roots coming from our past. There's patterns coming from our past. And one thing that I help you do in Are You Really Okay is begin to identify some of those patterns. Begin doing things like a timeline activity where you write out the most significant things that have happened to you so that you can begin to process and look for patterns. Or a genogram where you start to chart things in your family history, qualities and traits and relationships and interactions so that you can look for patterns in how you function today. So our past is really important. And it actually comes up in not only our personal health, but our relationship health as well. Right now, Chris, on the podcast, I'm doing a series called Couples Therapy, where I'm having on-air sessions with couples, marriage therapy. And what's interesting about these sessions is that the problem they're coming with has to do with what's happening today. So for example, a recent couple, the problem is the frequency in their intimacy life. But as we dig a little deeper, we realize what's happening in the present is actually rooted in things from the past. There's past sexual abuse, there's past infidelity. And then when you back up a little bit more, there's past trauma from childhood. There's things that they have been through. There's past family dysfunction. The wounds from our past will always find their way into our present if we don't deal with them and heal from them. And sometimes it takes us going backward so that we can move forward. And that's a really big part of the journey of health.
Yeah, exactly that. And just a quick plug real fast, because I think your podcast is awesome. It's Love and Relationships, guys, with Debra Fileta. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to access that. But Debra, I love what you said about needing to go back, because you also said in the book that really our problem as humans is that we can't simply forget unless we first acknowledge, understand, and learn from our past. Now, I want to suss this out just a little bit with you, because it's easy to acknowledge, yeah, for sure, this happened. I remembered it. It sucked. I hated it.
Right.
But it's harder to understand and learn. Like, what's required of us in order to understand and learn, Debra?
Yeah, it's not just about simply recalling memories. It's then about making connections to how those things have impacted you today. An example is I was working with a guy who, him and his wife were having all of these explosions in their marriage, this explosive tension and conflict and fights. And when they came in, he was like, she's a nag. She constantly tells me what to do and nags me all day long. And she's like, this guy just keeps exploding. I give him one gentle correction and he goes off on me. What's going on? As we dug a little bit deeper into his past, and I said, what does it make you feel when your wife corrects you? Well, it makes me feel like I'm not good enough for her. Sit with that for a minute, I said to him. Has there ever been a time in your life that you felt that way before her? And he sat there for a minute. And this big, bald guy, muscles, tattoos, started to weep and said, when I was a kid, I never felt good enough. I never felt like I was enough for my dad. It was always his way or the highway. And at age 16, I finally decided it was time for me to leave. And I left and we never spoke again. But if you think about it, Chris, here's this grown man, but he's functioning out of the wounds of his 16-year-old self, and not making connections to why that's a trigger for him when someone corrects him or when someone suggests he do something differently, because he is struggling with this belief that he's not good enough that stems from the wounds of his childhood that he's never dealt with. So he's exploding left and right in the present when really what needs to happen is healing from the past. And so many of us have those type of things that are actually rooted in things that we've never really acknowledged and healed from.
I love that, Debra, because you've sort of painted the picture of the need to sit with emotions, difficult, negative emotions and such. But I'd love to connect this for the listeners, because oftentimes I believe difficult, negative emotions can be used as flashlights, like you said, to get back down into these early belief systems like this gentleman. Okay, so if we go back to the fact that he's feeling angry and unappreciated, whatever, and I'm going to use that emotion, I'm going to say to him, okay, when's the earliest time you can remember feeling that same thing? And we're going to go back. So what I'd love for you to do, Debra, is teach us, how do we sit with our thoughts? How do we sit with our emotions in a productive way that can push us to move forward in life?
Yeah. First and foremost, I don't think we give ourselves the time or permission to do this on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we actually expect to make connections when we're going, distracting, numbing? Like, we don't give ourselves the time and space to even sit with these things. And I think what you call flashlights, I really like that term. I call them emotional sore spots. When
cool.
You've got some sort of intense reaction in the present, it's almost like a sore spot. Have you ever gotten a black and blue mark? The other day I was leaving my house and my shoulder hit the coat hook that was hanging there and just kind of like banged right into it. I had a black and blue the next day. And when my husband came near me the next day to kind of give me a hug, he touched that spot without realizing it. It got a reaction out of me. My reaction was not because of him. It was because I already had a wound there.
Oh, that's good.
We've got these emotional sore spots that we don't even realize they're there. And here's how you know they're there. When you find that intense or overreacting emotion, like I'm over responding here and I know it, but I'm not sure why. Like, why is this getting such a reaction out of me? There's a good chance there's an emotional sore spot there, something we need to do a little work in and dig a little bit deeper. I think it starts with making the time and then allowing ourselves to feel, rather than feeling like we've got to distract ourselves from any type of discomfort that we face, any type of uncomfortable feeling. We try to run from it. We try to escape it. We try to distract ourselves or go to some addiction to cover it up. Like, I don't want to feel this. But what if the key to getting healthy was sitting with that uncomfortable emotion and learning from it?
Is that why you said, I believe that our inability to deal with our emotions is often rooted in a lack of awareness about the emotions themselves? I thought that was really brilliant.
Yeah. We often aren't aware of what's going on because we don't take the time to sit with it. We kind of categorize feelings into two parts, either good or bad. You and I know, as a counselor, I'll tell you this, there's no such thing as a good feeling or a bad feeling.
Right.
It's
they just are.
What we do with that.
Yes.
Feeling. But we have a tendency to kind of think, oh, this feeling feels good, this feeling doesn't feel good. And the ones that don't feel good, my job is to make them go away, rather than, okay, I should have some sort of an awareness. What am I feeling? Why am I reacting this way? What is actually going on deep down inside? What's happening underneath the surface? For some people, Chris, that's not simple. And I get it. I have committed my life to being a licensed counselor and helping people in that process. Some people will be naturally inclined and will be able to say, okay, I'm going to sit with some of this stuff, think through it. I'm an internal processor. I'm going to be able to kind of make some connections. Other people need help to do that. And it's absolutely okay and good to seek out the help of a professional counselor. Maybe you feel stuck and you're like, I don't know how to make these connections. I don't know why I'm reacting this way. I don't know what childhood wounds I need to deal with. That's okay. But just to be able to acknowledge, hey, here's what I need to change. And now I'm going to take the steps to get the help to help me make some of these connections that I'm having a hard time making on my own.
how's that played out for you? You talked about it in the book a bit, your own experience with depression and anxiety, and I'd love for listeners to resonate with your story to the extent you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you're healthy. Just because you're a licensed professional counselor does not mean that you are immune to this stuff, you know? And for me, it kind of started a few years ago with a series of panic attacks. I opened chapter 1 talking about my very first panic attack on a safari bus. I was on a outing with my husband and kids. It was supposed to be a fun day. It was 96 degrees out. I was sweating bullets. I'm on this safari bus where we're looking at all these animals. Next thing you know, I start feeling off. Like, I don't feel good. I'm really hot. I feel kind of sick. I'm sweating and there's nowhere to go. I can't escape. There's animals to the left and right of me. Like I am stuck. And all of a sudden I don't feel like I can breathe. I'm like having shortness of breath, palpitations. My heart rate is like skyrocketing. I'm sweating. My arms start to feel a little bit numb. And I literally feel like I am about to die on that safari bus. For those of you who've had a panic attack, you know that the anxiety in your body can feel so real and so scary that you do feel like you're going to die. I didn't. In a few minutes, I drank some water. My 6-year-old was sitting next to me. He started talking to me. It kind of snapped me out of what was happening inside of me to back to what was happening around me. And I was able to kind of work through that. But even as a licensed counselor, I didn't recognize that that was a panic attack right away. My first thought was that something is going on inside of my body. I am sick. There's something wrong. And to fast forward the story, because I could spend so much time here, but essentially I ended up doing a series of tests and blood work and everything was fine with me. So then it started having me question, like, what is this? These panic attacks happen a little bit more often. And I am so grateful for my education as a licensed counselor, because I really believe the Lord used it to shine a light for me on what I needed to work through. And the fact that some of this stuff was stemming from my own emotional sore spots. You see, a few years before that incident, I had gone through a really traumatic experience. I was pregnant. I went in to get a checkup. Next thing you know, they're telling me that I'm miscarrying. And within a few minutes, I start to hemorrhage, which means bleeding profusely to the point where I literally almost died. They rushed me into emergency surgery. It was a really traumatic ordeal, and it happened in a split second. So you go through that. You're kind of in survival mode. Like, okay, I just went through this trauma. I got to survive. I got to get through it. You go home. I've got kids to take care of. I've got my life. You just kind of pick back up. I felt like I had grieved the loss of losing this child, but I don't think I ever really grieved the fact that I almost lost my life. I don't think I ever really processed that side of it the way that I needed to. And when you go through trauma, it's like you're in survival mode. But years later, when life is safe and secure, sometimes that trauma comes back up and it's like, it's time to deal with me now. Just like when a soldier goes off to war, the effects of PTSD don't usually shine through until later on when they're back home. They're not even engaged in the war and in battle and in the trauma anymore. But now that life is safe and secure and settled, it's like your body's like, okay, we're ready now. We got to go there. And for me, that's when the panic attacks started. And I was able to make the connection that my reaction in the present, this anxiety I was having in the present, was actually rooted in the fear of the past. Like something is going to happen. I almost died and I could almost die again. So my body was almost overcompensating. It's like, you felt these weird things before, but a few years ago, you almost died. So now it's overcompensating for those fears. And my panic attacks were actually rooted in the things I'd experienced in my past.
And so patterns started to show up in your life of being able to trace experiences and your Your limbic system's freaking out. Talk about, Debra, what you learned, rather how you learned to recognize those exact patterns so that the listeners can really do the same thing. Recognizing patterns in hopes of gaining a foothold on the undercurrent of anxiety, so common to a lot of us.
I know, it's so true. You do have to look for patterns. And I think it's sometimes hard to do in the middle of a panic attack because you're not thinking logically. Your amygdala, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for emotional memory, your fight or flight response, it's the fire alarm that's going off, like get to safer ground. It's not the time to think and process, why do I feel this way? How do I? You're not going to be able to make those connections in the middle of an anxiety attack. The goal in the middle of an anxiety attack is just to survive, to get through, to make yourself as comfortable as possible, to distract yourself, deep breathing. There's a lot of strategies to help you overcome a panic attack in the present. But when things settle, that's when you've got to do some of that work of what caused this reaction? Do I have triggers? If so, what are those triggers? Can I find patterns to some of those triggers? I found the pattern for me was it always had to do with my physical health. I always felt like something was wrong physically. I was feeling lightheaded, or something was feeling a little numb, or I was feeling a little off. I was probably just dehydrated. But my trigger was to feel a little off in my body, which then set me back to that place.
Wow.
Where I was in a traumatic situation with my body. Something was not right years ago. And so now anytime I would get close to something feeling a little off in my body, that would be the pattern that would cause my entire body to react. Our amygdala is responsible for emotional memory. And I talk about this in Are You Really Okay? Because it's a beautiful alarm system that God has given us. But sometimes it false alarms. And in the case of a panic attack, those alarms are going off left and right when really there's nothing to be afraid of in the here and now. And we've got to learn to make those connections so that we can begin to heal from some of that stuff.
So what do you do these days when you get a physical sensation that has the potential to trigger an old memory that would then cue up trauma responses? What do you do these days? How does that play out?
I'm so grateful that I have these tools in my toolbox, and that I've been able to teach so many people to have these tools in your toolbox, because when you are facing something like a panic attack, you've got to remember, fight physical with physical. You cannot logically talk yourself out of a panic attack, because when your amygdala is firing, your cortex, which is the part of your brain that's going to be a little bit more logical, is kind of off the grid at that point. You're not going to be able to logically talk your body down. So you've got to fight physical with physical, which means use tactics to get yourself physically to a good place. For me, that looks like deep breathing. It looks like centering, which is an activity where you kind of allow yourself to focus on what's going on around you rather than what's happening inside of you. Like, oh my gosh, I feel terrible, I'm going to die. Instead of all of that happening inside of you, you focus on the things around you. Like, where am I? What's happening around me? What are the people doing around me? How do I feel outside of my body rather than inside? So things like centering, things like meditation, things like deep breathing, things like muscle relaxation activities, all of these external things are going to help you get to a healthy spot and kind of drift until you get to safer ground. I've learned to do that. I've learned to recognize the first signs of a panic attack and get myself to a good place very quickly. Because these are skills.
Yeah.
You don't have these muscles naturally. You've got to learn, what does it look like to figure this stuff out, to practice these things so that I am not ruled by my anxiety. And so I'm grateful that I've been able to fight physical with physical, but then also I've learned how to fight mental with mental. I've learned what to tell myself. I've learned how to correct my faulty thinking of what's happening in my body. I've learned to recognize what's an emergency from what's not an emergency, and to use my logic to fight the negative or unhealthy thoughts that might creep in. The problem is recognizing that sometimes you've got to fight physical with physical, sometimes you fight mental with mental, and learning to differentiate is really important.
So if that's a skill to be developed, what are the things you tell yourself? What are the things you do practically? Like, walk us through. Let's say, okay, Debra, you can feel it today. Today's Monday at the time we're recording here today, and you can feel that thing rising. What's the first thing you do? What's the first thing you tell yourself? How do you create that shift?
Well, if I'm not at a place where it's a full-blown panic attack, and honestly, praise God, I haven't had that in a very long time. So it just goes to show you that just because this is a part of your life today doesn't mean it has to be a part of your life forever. Mm-hmm. And I think some people feel like this is it, but I haven't had a panic attack for years, and I'm so grateful for that. But I will tell you this, I have felt it coming on. And so when I'm at a place where it's not full blown, I'm starting to feel my body's getting a little hot. My heart rate's starting to go up a little bit. It's not a full blown panic attack. I'm still thinking properly. I have to talk myself through it. Okay, here's what's happening. My amygdala is responding to some sort of a trigger. I'm so grateful for my amygdala. Thank you, Lord, for this emotional memory that keeps me safe during hard times. But right now it's false alarming. This is a false alarm. There's nothing happening right now. I am safe. I am in control. I am healthy. There's nothing physically wrong with my body. And I begin to talk myself through it mentally. I fight the mental with mental so that I don't spiral. And you can't fight mental with mental if you've never actually taken the time to take inventory of those negative thoughts. Sometimes our negative thoughts are so automatic, they're so familiar that we don't even recognize that they're happening. So part of awareness is, yes, we talked about being emotionally aware, but you've also got to be mentally aware of the thoughts that are happening in your mind that are so automatic that you don't even recognize them. You take the time to face those thoughts, take ownership of them, write them down. Like when you're having an anxious moment, write down all the thoughts going on in your brain, start to face them, put them on paper so that you can begin fighting them with truth.
What I heard you say in that moment, Debra, is that we may have a very, very real reason to feel, to think a certain way, but it may not be true. Therefore, we need to sit with it, to analyze, to expose these thoughts to truth, and then make a decision going forward.
Yes. Can I interrupt and tell you?
Yes, please.
One of the most life-changing parts of writing this book for me was seeing this process played out in the life of Jesus. So in one section of the book, I talk through the different emotions that Jesus experienced. First of all, Jesus was emotional. He felt deeply and he expressed those emotions in a deep way. But one of the most powerful parts was seeing Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in that portion of scripture, we read that he was sweating droplets of blood. Medical experts have looked at that passage and they've identified something called hematidrosis, which is a rare condition of being under such distress. They think it's a fight or flight response, such agony and such distress that your blood vessels begin to break open and seep into your sweat glands because you're under such distress. So they think it's a fight or flight mechanism. So if you think about it, in that moment, his fight or flight response, his amygdala was telling him to run. You need to get out of there. This is not safe. Get to higher ground. You are in danger. But he chose to trust his God over his feelings because he knew that though our emotions are real, they're not always true. And sometimes they're false alarming because of our trauma, because of our past, because of the things we have been through before. And Jesus was able to kind of block out that fight or flight response and choose to stay because of me and because of you. And when I read that, and I thought of the times when my fight or flight was like, you're going to die. This is it. You're never going to get over this. You are doomed. And to think that I too could remember that my feelings are real, but they're not always true. And just because I feel a certain way doesn't mean that's my reality. To see that in the life of Jesus was just so profound for me in the process of healing, to be able to know that he relates to my emotions and my pain and my fight or flight response, and he can redeem and help us through it all. It was just a powerful, powerful moment for me.
Earlier, we talked about having awareness of and then sitting with our emotions. But in your recent statement, you just said, hey, just because we're feeling something doesn't mean it's true. So the question I'd like to ask then is, can we trust our emotions and our intuition? You know, there's a lot of conversation these days about leaning into your intuition. You know what's best for you. But I'll just quote you, Debra. You said sometimes reality isn't what our emotions are telling us. So suss that out.
Yeah, just because you feel something doesn't make it true. Your emotions are real, but they're not always telling you the truth. And that's what we have to learn. Your emotions are real. It's a real signal. It's a signal that your body's like, hey, there's something you need to pay attention to. But that doesn't always mean that it's accurate. It's, sometimes you can think of it like a false alarm. It doesn't mean it's always a false alarm. It just means that there can be times when the alarm is false. It's not a real fire. There's nothing to really run from. And so your emotions are a part of that signal for you to identify, is this real? Is this safe? Is this dangerous? Is this not? But there's also other things that need to go into the equation of whether or not this is real. So those other things, for example, are logic, my experiences, my community, God's word. When you put all of that together with your feelings, there's a good chance you're going to be moving in the right direction. When you isolate just to how you feel and you follow that through no matter what, there's a good chance you're going to end up in difficult and unhealthy places, because our feelings are part of the equation, but they should never be the one and only thing that leads the way.
That's really helpful, because I think one of the things I wanted to parse out for people is, okay, this is not about ignoring our emotions, but at the same time, it doesn't mean we give them decision-making power in our lives. And I think you sort of helped us work this out in terms of using logic, using reason, using past experiences, sitting, slowing down. Metacognition is a popular topic, of course, just thinking about our thinking enough to make decisions that are true, right? Did I hear you correctly in that?
Absolutely. Emotional health can be summarized by identifying your feelings, expressing them, learning to share them and express them to yourself and others and God, but then questioning your feelings and making sure that those things are kind of kept in check, because questioning your feelings is the check and balance to identifying and experiencing your feelings. We've got to balance it out with, just because I feel this way, what does that mean? How do I incorporate that into my life? What does that mean in the bigger picture of emotional health? And it's definitely not about ignoring it. If anything, it's about leaning into it and figuring out where it's coming from and what the signal is telling me. Even when the emotion isn't true, it's still signaling something, right? So for me, the emotion itself wasn't true, but it's signaling, I've got some trauma I need to deal with. Something going on here underneath the surface.
No, that's awesome. And I think a good place to land this conversation would be here. What about then, Debra, the story that we tell ourselves? I think Brené Brown actually popularized that. The story I'm telling myself is, and that's a tool to use in interpersonal relationships. But I'd love to hear you coach us to greater maturity through this statement, because you said we may not be in charge of the whole story, but we are in charge of the way we tell the story to ourselves. That's powerful.
Yeah, I specifically want to focus in on that phrase when we're looking at our past history, our past trauma, because you can't change what's happened to you, but you can change the narrative of that story. You can change the lessons that you pull from it. You can change the perspective that you have on it. So you can't change the details of what happened, but you can change how you tell the story to yourself. And I think specifically, I focus in on this when we're talking about trauma and learning to heal from trauma. I could have looked at my trauma as, I almost died. That was it. That was the end. I was minutes away from death. But one day, God shined through this traumatic flashback I was having. And he told me a different story. He said, you didn't almost die that day, because nobody can snatch you from my hands if it's not the right time. I was in control the entire time. You didn't almost die that day. And all of a sudden, I realized I had been believing one version of the story, which was I was minutes away from dying, rather than leaning into the reality that God is sovereign and good and powerful, and nobody can take me from his hands until he says it's time. It's like the same experience, but how you tell yourself the story will either empower you to go on and live life and see things differently, or it will paralyze you in fear and worry and anxiety and powerlessness. And so I think for all of us to be able to look back and take inventory, like, what is the story I tend to tell myself when things happen in life and about my past trauma and wounds? And it doesn't mean we don't acknowledge the hard things.
Right.
But the narrative that goes with the story is going to make or break us.
So good. Well, the book is Are You Really Okay? Getting real about who you are, how you're doing, and why it matters. Guys, go to the show notes right now at wintoday.tv. Debra, I love this time with you. You're such a wellspring of knowledge and just richness for us. So thanks for being here today. Is there anything else we haven't talked about that you'd love to leave with the listeners?
I just appreciate you having me on. I appreciate your heart for conversations that are not superficial.
Right.
And that are getting to the root.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for having me on and giving me a chance to share. I really appreciate it.
It's a real joy. Hey, I'd love for people to stay connected to your work. Tell us how to connect.
The best way is at my website, which is truelovedates.com. It's a relationship advice website, but it houses everything I'm doing, as well as on Instagram. I'm always hanging out on Instagram at Debra Fileta.
Beautiful. Sounds good. Debra, thanks for being here today. It's great to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Debra Fileta. She is a wellspring of wisdom, and I would love for you to get a copy of her book. So go to wintoday.tv/episode 287. That's wintoday.tv/episode 287. Get a copy straight away. I know it's going to add a ton of value to your life. Well, listen, next week on the podcast, Shauna Niequist is here. We're talking all about chaos, change, loss, and how to practice self-compassion through it all. Really a profound conversation, and we went deep. So here's a preview.
And so I pick a major, tangly, dark thing in my life that I need to figure out. And I think it'll take about 2 years to figure that out. And so I write about it for about a year, and then I talk about it in situations like this for like 6 more months. But if it's a passing thing that you think someone else is going to really connect with, there's just not enough energy for that. It has to be something that really burdens you, or it absorbs you on a deep level.
Shauna Niequist is here next week. Don't miss it. Thanks again for joining me this week. I believe you should be able to live at your best in your relationships, in your mental and emotional health, and in your personal and spiritual growth. Self-help and life hacks help, but they will not turn the key to total life transformation that lasts. And creating a plan for sustainable transformation is what Win Today is all about. That's why I'd like to invite you to join the inner circle of readers on my email list who receive weekly strategies for growth. Just go to wintoday.tv right now to sign up. It's absolutely free. Lastly, whether you're a new listener or have been listening to the show for a while, I'd really appreciate your rating and review of Win Today on Spotify and on the Apple Podcast app. Until next week, let's connect on social media and on my YouTube channel, and of course at wintoday.tv. Thanks again for listening today. I hope you have an awesome week. We'll talk to you again really soon. Bye-bye.